Awesome. Thanks, Corey. And thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. Appreciate you taking the time and excited to be sharing about ISO 27701 with you. So just before I jump in to set the stage, in case you aren't familiar with ISO 27701, didn't catch the first part of this webinar series. So ISO 27701 is a privacy overlay for ISO 27001. So it takes the ISO 27001 concept of an information security management system and says you need to extend that to privacy, you develop what's called a privacy information management system. That is how you manage privacy over your scope. So all that to say, ISO 27001 is a requirement if you're going to get ISO 27701. So that's some of the context that we're going to be coming with today. Pretty much all our clients we're working with on ISO 27001 and 27701, so that really informs a lot of how I'm going to be talking and how we typically approach ISO. So what are we going to cover today? We'll talk about internal versus external audit, who is typically involved in the audit, are you a processor, a controller, or both? What are common findings? And then the audit process. So what is it like when you're ready to go and get your ISO certification? All right, so let's set the stage with external audit versus internal audit. So external audit or certification audit is done only by a qualified firm. So in almost all circumstances, these are accredited by what's called a certifying body who says this company that's doing the audit meets the requirements of a different system, ISO 17021. So those standards are being met, and that organization is accredited to issue ISO certifications. The internal audit, this is a requirement, and it is done by really anyone who is qualified and who is independent of the PIMS activities. It's PIMS, Privacy Information Management System, by the way. So that can be resources you have internally if your company is of that size, maybe has internal audits for SOX purposes or other requirements you're beholden to. Otherwise, it can be outsourced, even though it says internal audit. It can be outsourced to a firm like Risk360. That is a good portion of what we do is ISO internal audits. Yeah, it can be outsourced, like I said. It's still internal audit in the sense of the information that it's providing to management and how it feeds into management reviews. All right, so who should expect to be involved when you're taking on ISO 27701 certification efforts? We always start with upper level management. An ISO management system requires commitment from the very top. So the very top needs to, one, pass down their commitment to security and privacy, but also receive results of internal, external audits, feedback on the management system, and work with other stakeholders to address those and achieve what's known as continual improvement of the ISO program. Beyond that, we see these next three, they may be very closely tied together depending on the size of your organization, but we see individuals from compliance, we see individuals from legal, and sometimes if it's separate from those two organizations, the data protection officer or DPO. So these are typically the people and departments who are most closely tied to the day-to-day oversight of privacy at a company. Information security I can't say it enough, you need security to achieve privacy. So ideally, these components of the business are already working closely together. And then when we get to the audit, we're going to typically get some input from information security to make sure we fully understand some of the technical elements of the standard. Finally, people from the product team. So we'll talk a little bit about privacy by design today. Privacy by design, I'd say, requires that people from the product organization are involved closely with the people who are managing the privacy program day to day. So in some cases, we'll actually get with members of the product team and really understand how they're implementing privacy in their day-to-day work and development. All right, so the next component of getting ready is understanding the role of your organization in the processing ecosystem. So the SOA, or Statement of Applicability, is really where this begins. The Statement of Applicability, it's can be a little confusing if you're new to ISO, but it's where you actually take results of your risk assessment and define the controls that you need to put in place to adequately address those risks. Most of the time, it's going to be the controls outlined in Annexes 7 and 8 of ISO 27701. 7 relates to controllers, 8 relates to processors. So within the Statement of Applicability, you're going to include those relevant controls and a description of why they're included or excluded for your organization. So in either case, you have to have a justification in one direction or the other. So to set the picture for those who aren't as familiar, controller it's actually not specifically defined in ISO 27701. In my opinion, that means they're relying on the GDPR definition. So the controller would be the body that determines the means of data processing. So really, that means directing collection of the data. So the controller, they may be using a processor to collect the data. They're saying, we want to do some kind of processing. We're going to use this company to do it, but we want to use it, and that makes the company as directing the processing the controller. So say on the human resources side, you use an HRIS system like Gusto. You, as the purchaser of Gusto, are still the controller of all that data. Gusto is doing particular processing on your behalf. So that leads into the role of processor. The processor is processing data for a specific purpose on the controller's instructions. So again, it can be a little confusing at first because the processor is really saying, this is how we process data, but in GDPR and privacy terms, the controller is saying, the way you process data aligns with processing that we need done, so we're choosing you as our processor to process it the way you describe. So think of it in those terms. Now, I know we could go on for a while. Most organizations, in some sense, are controller and processor, but part of the preparation for the audit is understanding what's relevant to your stakeholders. So jumping back to the HR perspective around a controller, say electing a HRIS system, that's an important activity for your organization. You want to make sure that privacy is in place, but since it's data of your employees, are those really the scope of your ISO program that you want to provide this certification to demonstrate something to? And typically, for better or for worse, the answer is no. You as an organization are concerned with what your customers are concerned about. So if as a customer I'm sending data about, say, my prospects to you to do some processing, well, I want to know that you're going to protect their privacy when you're processing the data. I'm less concerned that, say, I have a platform I'm using to do the processing, and or you have a platform for the processing, and my employees have logins to that platform. I'm really concerned with the data entrusted to us that I'm providing to you. So to that end, typically most of the clients we deal with at Risk 360 are data processors. Rule of thumb is in the B2B context. A company is probably a processor, and that's the main focus of their privacy information management system. Of course, there can be exceptions, but that is what we see more often. And of course, you can do both. You don't have to elect one or the other. You could have significant controller and processor operations that matter to your stakeholders. And that's really, again, the question that you want to answer is who are the interested parties for your privacy program, and what do they want to see in your certification? But you can do both. So now I'll talk a little bit about what we see when we actually step in with companies getting ready for their certifications, and we do readiness or gap assessment, internal audit ahead of that certification. So all the time we see findings around the management system. Like I mentioned, we deal with a lot of companies who are already ISO 27001 compliant. So they know the drill to develop a management system. It's not always done when we first come in, something that needs to be done. What I tell organizations is, if you look at ISO 27701, yeah, it says you start with taking the references in ISO 27001 to information security and basically changing those to information security and privacy. It really becomes not just a editing exercise, but it's really a mindset shift to really think about what privacy is, who your stakeholders are, and how that affects all the different components of the management system, including your objectives, your communication plans, your policies, your risk assessment. So that is the next finding, is risk assessment. It does need to include, as applicable, the impact of your security risks on privacy if they were to materialize, as well as specific risks, typically in a privacy impact assessment, around risks to data subjects of the processing that's taking place. Finally, one other management system item we often see is internal audit hasn't been done. So a lot of times we're handling that as the internal auditor. The bottom line is it needs to be done for privacy as well as security for you to be ready for your certification. So a few other ones we commonly see. One would be temporary files. So this is one that trips up all sorts of companies. What ISO is really looking for is a company to have an understanding of the temporary files created by processing that could contain PII, to inventory those and make sure there are procedures for deletion. So of course you're asking, what is a temporary file? This is one there's not a great definition, not a ton of agreement on, but typically like files written into memory during processing, metadata around queries would be another example. What I encourage clients to do is you define what you say temporary files are. And if you have that definition, you're managing them the way the standard wants you to, then you're typically good going into your external audit. A couple elements around privacy by design. So privacy by design is really having clear guidance for your teams, and when a software change might impact privacy, to have a method for your privacy team to get involved and make sure that any potential risk is documented and appropriately addressed. One kind of subcomponent of that is PII minimization objectives. This is something I really love that ISO 27701 calls out, because there are a lot of ways an organization can approach data minimization. What ISO says is that you should document your overall approach. So that can be avoiding collection, it can be collecting, but inventorying, applying strict retention periods. Bottom line is you want to have objectives documented and that you're able to communicate to your engineering teams, those that need to know as they're making changes. So that's an area companies typically haven't gone to that level of depth. So it's a common finding for companies starting out. And a couple kind of foot faults in the standard. One is define procedures for dealing with legally binding requests for PII. So if you actually receive a subpoena or a court order for PII, how are you going to handle that? Who's going to be involved? And then the last one would be procedures for notification of your customers when you're adding or changing a subprocessor. So this is spelled out clearly in GDPR, or in ISO, it's in GDPR as well, but in ISO 27701, it says customers need to be notified when you add or change subprocessors. So of course we see other gaps in our day-to-day, but these are probably the most common ones for organizations starting out with their PIM certifications. All right, so with that background, what do the phases of the external audit actually look like? How can you ensure you're successful? So the first item really ties in with the controller processor discussion earlier. It's understanding ultimately you're probably getting this certification to help show customers and ultimately drive revenue. So what scope is going to meet those needs? Beyond just controller processor, what products are in scope, data centers if you host those, office locations if you're a company that has significant physical office space, all that should be determined, and you should ensure your scope is in line with those so that you can achieve the maximum value ultimately in the sales cycle. Review your statement of applicability, so make sure if there are controls that don't apply, you've scoped those out. Otherwise, you have a justification of inclusion for every control that's in there. Then prepare your team for your audit. So you don't want anyone just going in cold, not even sure who they're talking to or what they're trying to achieve. Make sure they understand, hey, this is our external audit. This is how you answer questions from the auditor. Give them good information, enable them to do their jobs. How to do screen sharing. I could tell some stories on that, but we occasionally, someone will make an honest mistake. You just want them to be aware, hey, in this session, you might need to share your screen, and make sure they have time to think through this, ask questions about what the audit's going to be like. Next, doing spot checks. So the internal audit is a great activity. For those activities that are ongoing, you want to probably do a little check right before the audit and make sure the people actually are doing what they're supposed to, everything's operating correctly. Next, build a great relationship with the auditor. There are lots of reasons to do this. It's not necessarily the biggest one you're thinking of. So auditors, external auditors, I would say, are very fair. They're going to give you a fair audit, whether they like you or not. But building a great relationship is important because there's so much more to the audit. You're going to be spending a couple days just on the phone together all day. You want things to move along at your pace. You want everything to go smoothly, to be pleasant. So just having that relationship, again, it doesn't compromise the objectivity. Auditors are very fair, but it just makes it easier for everyone when there is a good relationship. You want to have a clear project plan and a status report cadence. So without a clear project plan, you might have the risk that your auditor didn't realize you needed your report or certification, say by the end of October, because that's what you promised to a client. The auditor is thinking, actually, I'm not going to get that report out until Thanksgiving. Then you have a disconnect that you could have resolved if you have a clear project plan in place. Then also set up status reports. So make sure there's some time to get together, understand where the auditor is, make sure they're still on track for your timeline, and have some time already scheduled on a periodic basis to have the back and forth on any open questions. All right, so during the audit, what do teams do to make sure the audit goes well? Like I mentioned earlier, making sure all parties are prepared for the audit. So I listed out the organizations that are typically involved in some way in the audit process. It could be walkthroughs with the auditor, it could just be gathering and providing evidence. Providing your evidence on time. So a lot of organizations will have commitments around when you will have your evidence in to enable the audit to occur on schedule. Don't miss those. No, neither side wants to be in that position. But if you have a strong functioning program and you're prepared for the audit, then you are able to, everyone's able to commit and provide evidence on time so the auditor can do their job. During walkthroughs, be engaged. Be willing to tell the auditor what they need to know. Describe your process as well so that the auditor's getting the information that they need, and then helps them be sure, like, oh, this process is running well because this person could speak to it so well. Again, they're still going to look at evidence to confirm, but when you're engaged and provide a good overview, then it puts them at ease. It gives them confidence that it is a live, breathing program that controls are operated. Knowing your controls to this, I really can't say enough. It doesn't matter who you're working with to, run the program day to day. You could have outsourced consultants who help in a CISO or other capacity. You could have Risk 360 supporting in the development and implementation of your program. But to get your certification, the auditor needs to be confident that you, as a certified entity, understand your program and actually own it. So you're actually driving that that the required activities are taking place. For example, that there's a requirement to manage your temporary files, and you can talk about who's involved, again, whether it's internal or external, but who's involved to make sure that's happening on a periodic basis. Okay. And then the last one, forming a partnership with the auditor. Again, this is just about achieving mutually positive outcomes by having a good project timeline and making sure everyone understands when things need to be done, how to best get a hold of each other so that things can keep moving. Okay, so after the audit, what do you do when you actually pass the audit and the auditor says, you're approved for certification, I'm submitting it to QA? What happens after that? So really, you want to continue to work with the auditor to make sure that everything from that point continues to happen on time and meet your requirements. If you have nonconformities or corrective actions in your audit, there are forms that the auditor will need you to complete, typically called the NCPAR. They'll send a template to you. You'll have to fill out your corrective action plan and make sure Clause 10 within ISO 27001 calls out the things that need to be documented for a nonconformity. So just make sure your auditor can also help guide you here, but make sure you're looking at those Clause 10 requirements as you're drafting everything. Then you're really looking forward, so working with parties internally to make sure they understand how to maintain the program. So looking at operation of those controls that we talked about earlier, making sure the control owners are aware, they have it documented. It could be within our tool, Phalanx GRC, or could be tools you're using internally, Outlook calendars. Just there are reminders for those periodic recurring processes. If there were changes to your vendor management program, making sure those are fully baked into the software you're using or forms that are supporting that process, so that that's getting done each and every time and you can show the auditor next year. You want to schedule your audit for next year and just get it on the calendar early. That way there's a mutual understanding. Stakeholders internally know to schedule around that, and there's not a risk of it falling off the calendar and suddenly you're scrambling to make sure you get your surveillance audit on time. Then lastly, how are you going to share the accomplishment? So I want to be clear, like getting ISO 27001, ISO 27701, these are really big deals for an organization, and you want to achieve the maximum value for the time, the effort that you've put in. So you want to think through with sales organization, with marketing, how you're going to communicate this to clients, communicate it to the world so that they know when you're working with our company, you know that we've taken these steps around privacy to make sure that there's privacy for the data you're entrusting us with. This actually is something it should be included within your privacy information management system, your communication plan. So make sure you've thought about that and are ready to go and start blasting it out, and your people internally are prepared to speak on it. All right, so that's the run through of how to ensure you're ready for your ISO 27701 audit. At this point, I'd love to open it up for questions. So you can submit those in the webinar module. Corey, do we have any?
So guys, if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Phil's here to answer. We also included a handout for this. Phil developed a white paper, the path to the privacy program, ISO 27701 is included as a download if you're interested in downloading it now. So Phil, the first question that we have is, if I'm already ISO 27001 like certified, what are the steps to become ISO 27701 certified?
Yeah, great question. Really, you've done so much of the legwork by getting to ISO 27001 compliance, getting that program up and running, that it can be, I wouldn't say easy, but a relatively shorter process to get to 27701 compliance. A few steps would be thinking about a governance structure. So do you have similar privacy stakeholders as the way you're governing your ISMS currently? If so, then you can really layer on top of the ISMS. But I'd say go through and you really look at just all of the clauses in succession with a privacy-specific lens. So you start out redefining your context, interested parties. That helps you define your scope, and then from there you're able to think about your risks, your statement of applicability, your resourcing, and ultimately go through the internal audit, management review, and then you're really ready to be certified. So I'd say just whenever you're ready to take that step and take a fresh look at your ISMS with the privacy lens, that's really the best step to get going on your 27701 journey.
Very cool. So our next question, is there an ISO 27701 lead auditor certification for individuals similar to the one for 27001?
Yes, apologize. I'm 99% sure. I do believe I have that one. So yes, and I really apologize. I'd have to check and verify, but I did it through an organization called PECB. They do good training and issue the certificates. So yeah, 99% sure that's accurate.
Okay, and guys, feel free to please ask any questions that you have. We have a little bit more time left. Phil, so the next question is there any like software that you suggest using for the audit portion of ISO 27701?
Yeah, so at Risk 360, we have a home-built GRC platform called Phalanx. It's a great repository to, so it's what we do our assessments out of. So if you're working with us as a internal audit customer, you'll be in there submitting evidence for our assessment. You can also stand up your own assessment to do those control spot checks, collect documentation there. Has risk register features that enable ISO really compliance across all ISO standards. We use it for our ISO certifications at Risk 360. It has functionality for vendor management. Those are a few of the key elements, and again, we're using those in our program, and we are certified to 27001 and 27701, and even ISO 22301, which is business continuity. So it's been valuable for us. We're using it for our ISO certifications, and we see a lot of clients also able to leverage it as a great repository and way to make sure that things are getting done throughout the year.
Okay, so the next question is it mandatory to define in the scope statement that scope of certification is for the organization in its capacity as a controller or as a processor?
Yeah, it should. Your scope should indicate, like, I believe ours would say, like, so we're a controller and processor, so we would say, our scope is for Phalanx GRC and the controlling and processing activities therein, something to that effect. Alternatively, for just a processor, you could say, our scope is information security and privacy relating to X platform and our company's role as a processor for the platform. But yeah, it should really be clear in the scope statement and not just the statement of applicability.
Okay, Phil, that's actually the last questions, guys. We'll give you another minute if you have a question to submit. If you guys are done with questions, we can wrap it up. So yeah, I don't see any more questions coming up. So Phil, thank you for today, and everyone, thank you for joining. If you want to learn more, we have a upcoming webinar next quarter. With Phil going to part 3 with a little bit more things about, like, how do you actually maintain your program. And we also have constant content coming out. Phil has several white papers covering ISO 27701 as well as GDPR, other compliance sources. If you guys feel free to visit our website for more information. But thank you for joining us today, and everyone have a good day. Oh. Yeah. And sorry, someone has one more question.
All right.
Can I gain CPEs with this? The answer is no. Sorry, it's actually we're here to educate, but we're not like someone who offers those things for everyone. But thank you all for joining us today.